The camera you see here is the Fujifilm X-T5, a camera I have used for the past 3 years. And I have done literally any type of photography with it. I have done street photography, travel photography, landscape photography, videography, event photography, portrait photography. Every possible scenario that you can possibly imagine, I have done with this camera. And I would go as far as to say that this is my favorite camera that I have used so far. But there is one problem I have with it. And many of you would probably anticipate, oh, he's going to talk about autofocusing issues. But honestly, from a practical point of view, the biggest issue I had with this camera was build quality. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about in today's video, build quality. What issues I have encountered over the past 3 years of using the X-T5 regarding build quality, but also why build quality issues are actually just a symptom of a much bigger problem in Fujifilm's long-term strategy. So I would say, let's get into it. So just to give you a little bit of context, when I started out in photography, I was given by my parents a Fujifilm X-T30, which I used for many years, but I upgraded to an X-T2 at some point because the X-T30 was not weather sealed and I absolutely wanted to start shooting in the rain. So I got a second-hand, very well-used X-T2 from a professional photographer who didn't need it anymore, and it was really just a bargain as a deal because that camera was built like a tank, like amazing, top materials, and even after all these years of use, the build quality was amazing. But at some point, I upgraded to a Fujifilm X-T5, which was from a technological point of view just a completely different beast because in between the release dates of the Fuji X-T2 and the X-T5 were 6 years of progress. So from a technological point of view, the X-T5 had IBIS, it had a much higher resolution sensor, much better dynamic range at the base ISO, much better autofocus, much better video features, and it had basically every feature I could think of I would ever need in a camera. But one thing I immediately noticed when picking up the camera and trying it out in the store was that this camera was not particularly well built, or at least I didn't feel the same ruggedness that I felt for the X-T2 previously, because the materials felt a bit cheaper, while the dials also felt less tactile than the dials on the X-T2 I've used previously. But that was only the first impression, because just because a camera feels cheaper than a predecessor doesn't necessarily mean that it's gonna fall apart while using it in the long term, right? But within the first few months, I already immediately had the first issue, which was probably a factory-related issue that was concerning the specific badge that my X-T5 unit was part of, which is that the screen was very wobbly when it was flipped out. So I took the X-T5 to the camera store I've bought it from, and they would send it into Fujifilm, and the issue would be fixed. But what I didn't know is that it would take Fujifilm 6 weeks to have this issue fixed and have the camera sent back to me. And had I known this in advance, I would probably not have sent in this camera because I simply have to rely on the X-T5 for professional gigs. So in that time, I actually worked with a few rental units, most notably an XH2 that I rented for a few shoots where I needed 2 cameras, which I found was so much better built than the X-T5 and much more comparable to an X-T2 in terms of the materials used, but also just simply in terms of how the dials felt. But at some point I got the camera back, and for some reason they had replaced the bottom plate of the camera as well as the entire screen actually. And well, no problem for the next few months, but this shouldn't last for very long. So the first issue I encountered having the camera back was that the rear command dial was at some point not pressable anymore. So as you might know, on XT cameras, you can press in the front and the rear command dials and assign different functions to these buttons. But the rear one was simply not pressable anymore. And while the functions could still be used, I really had to press it in like relatively hard for anything to happen. The next issue that I had on the Fuji X-T5 is that the on-off switch of the camera would get stiff. And just for context, when I go out and shoot, I never leave my camera on standby. I turn it on if I find a photo worth pursuing, and after having taken it, I turn the camera off again. So yes, that on-off switch is being used a lot, but that does not really explain how a button can become so stiff that you have to use your nails or even 2 hands to use it. For reference, here's my 6-year-old X-T30, much cheaper camera, has been used for as much as my X-T5, and that on-off switch works impeccably. And then you go to the X-T5 and you have to throw the kitchen sink to get this thing to turn on or off. Additionally, my X106 is showing the same signs as my X-T5 after only 6 months of use. So it's really a problem specific to the current 5th generation of cameras that are just apparently not built to last anymore. And so far it might have sounded like these are all like cosmetic, experience-based issues, which aren't great, but at the same time also not deal breakers. And that I would agree with. But the next issue I want to talk about is a bit more of a worrying one, which is related to the shutter dial. So I feel like this is the only dial where we haven't had issues so far. Generally speaking, I shoot in aperture priority. So I let the camera choose the shutter speed that's right for the scene, and I set that dial to automatic. But the problem is that based on what I would think is a mechanical issue, the camera would occasionally think that I'm not actually setting the dial to auto, but to 1/8000th of a second. And it would sometimes just glitch around between this A position and this 1/8000th of a second position. And if that happens to you in the middle of a shoot and you're shooting an entire episode on a shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second, well, good luck, especially in mixed lighting or even in low light where you're gonna push that ISO to, I don't know, 100,000. Now, for instance, we are obviously on auto, but the camera is telling me I'm at 1/8000th of a second. So if I take a photo like this, it would ruin my entire photo, I can tell you for sure. So, good job, Fuji. It's like, what the fuck? So given the camera does not only feel cheap, but also has these weird hiccups after only 3 years of use that I never encountered on any Fujis before, I think it becomes really hard to deny that Fujifilm has reduced the build quality of their cameras. So let's see how this problem sadly fits into the broader camera strategy that Fujifilm is pursuing. For a very long time, Fujifilm has had 2 flagship cameras, the X-T line and the X-Pro line, which were well built, well spec'd, and just beautiful. And they really became Fujifilm's niche on the market. But at roughly around 2022, something changed because Fujifilm first of all introduced an XH line as the new flagship cameras with the XH2 and the XH2S, while also introducing a few more entry-level creator cameras such as the XM5 or the XS20. And this marked a shift of focus away from the X-T and the X-Pro cameras and led to the neglect of these series. On the one hand, the X-T5, given not a flagship anymore, has gotten worse in build quality, while the prices are of course going up. On the other hand, the X-Pro series of cameras has not seen a refresh since 2019, despite the high demand, and they have even discontinued the production of their most recent X-Pro 3 camera in 2022, with no real rumors of an X-Pro 4 ever since. And the reason why I consider it a mistake to shift away from the cameras Fujifilm is so good at producing, which in my opinion is the X-T and the X-Pro line, is because a neglect of the X-T and the X-Pro line is alienating many of Fujifilm's most loyal users for whom the X-T and the X-Pro lines are key reasons to shoot Fuji and not any other platform. Additionally, Fuji simply can't meet the demand of their arguably relatively bloated lineup right now, so how about just constraining the production to only a few models rather than having an XH, an XS, an XT, an XE, an X half, an X100, an XM, where you end up not meeting demands for most of these cameras. Finally, I think that Fujifilm should go back to their roots. The X-T and the X-Pro lines are the niche Fujifilm has a market advantage with, while on the high-end camera market, the XH line is, no offense, but hardly competitive when you can have the similar user experience but bigger sensors and better autofocus from the likes of Sony, Canon and Nikon. And everything I said today is based on my own personal experience of using the X-T5, and maybe I'm expecting a little bit too much from this camera given I use this camera on a daily basis. And what I would honestly be really curious to hear is what your experience was so far regarding build quality on your camera in case you own an X-T5. And with that being said, thank you so much for staying till the end, and I hopefully see you in next week's video. Bye.